Disclaimer for wildlife control consultant and Pest Keek podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Keek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Keek podcast family. Glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. I'm doing some multiple recordings here because the kitty of videos is getting a little low, so I'm trying to catch up a little bit here, especially when we start getting near the holidays and everything. Well, do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to have you subscribe. Also, ring the bell so you can be notified of updates. If you don't like dealing with YouTube, you can certainly reach me over at Rumble. I have an account there under Wildlife Control Consultant. If you need to reach out to me, reach me at Stephen@wildlifecontrolconsultant.com. That's Stephen, Stephen, at wildlifecontrolconsultant.com. You can also reach me on my old email address, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Well, I was thinking about what we were going to do today, and so looking through some of the literature, and one of the articles that kind of piqued my interest was something on trapping, and I thought this would be something interesting for people to think about. Many of us in the field are certainly going to be continuing to doing a lot of trapping, so let me pull that up here. Let me get that going. All right, well, there we are. So the research that was done back in the 1990s, specifically 1993, if memory serves. For some reason, I don't have the date listed in my citation. I'll have to correct that, but I believe it's 1993. And basically, it was an article written by Mr. Jorgenson, Dearis, and Whitworth, and the title of the article is The Effective Box Trap Design on Rodent Captures, and it was published in the Southwestern Naturalist, Volume 39, Issue 3, pages 291 to 294. So let me repeat that title for you again. The Effective Box Trap Design on Rodent Captures. Now, many of you have been following the podcast know that I'm very interested in using correct terminology. And so what these researchers were doing was they were saying, well, hey, are box traps, it's one with solid walls, more effective or less effective at capturing rodents than cage traps? So there has been some conflicting research in this particular regard. So these folks wanted to sort of revisit this particular question. Those of you that have done anything, followed anything in terms of the research scientists, you'll find that the Sherman trap, as pictured here on the right, is a common trap used by researchers looking to do rodent surveys, small mammal surveys, and they're collapsible. They can stack a lot in group, and so they've been used for years. So they're a very popular trap among researchers dealing with small mammals. So obviously, many of us in the wildlife control field aren't dealing with small mammals in the sense we're not out trying to do a population study on, Paramiscus or, the deer mouse. We're not doing that type of work. We're typically just there. We just want to capture them, kill them, as opposed to a capture and recapture study. But nevertheless, I think what this particular study does for us is I want you to be thinking about which trap is more effective at catching other animals, so you can actually cheat in the sense of stealing from the research design of these folks, using it on small mammals, and actually do a little study on your own to determine whether you're catching raccoons, let's say, in box traps more often than you are cage traps, right? And so let's talk a little about, but just so you know, I'm just giving you an illustration of a cage trap here. The cage trap they were using is a brand that I was not familiar with, so I didn't bother repeating it here. I'm not even sure the manufacturer is still in business, but I just wanted to show you that they're both traps of about the same size. So let's go into that study design. They used Sherman traps that were 3 by 3 by 9 inches. The cage trap was 3 by 3 by 10 inches. So the cage trap was just about 1 inch longer than the Sherman trap. They used a paired trapping design, which means that when they put one trap down at a particular location, they also put the other trap with it. So that way the animals that were coming by always had the choice of being captured by one trap or the other. And of course, at times there were situations where both traps had captures. But nevertheless, they were looking to see which trap was more likely to be entered in when you have a large study. And by the way, this was a rather large study. We're talking about over 1,000 trap nights at one location, and I think several hundred trap nights at the other location. So pretty rigorous design. So a trap night, in case you not familiar with that term, trap night means one trap for left over one night is one trap night. But if you had 2 traps at a location overnight, that would be 2 trap nights. If you had 5, that would be 5 trap nights in one night. So it's a way of trying to quantify how much time a trap was out, or a particular version of trap was out in the landscape at a particular time. So they used a paired trapping technique. The locations where they were doing the research was in Texas and New Mexico, 2 locations, and they did the study in the 2 months, September and October of 1992. And so they were trapping, of course, small mammals, because the opening of the trap was only a 3 by 3. So you're not going to catch a raccoon in this particular trap, right? 3 by 3. We're only looking at, something like this. It's not a very big hole for the rodents to get into. So these were small mammals that they were looking for, and that's the type of study that they did. And of course, both traps were baited in identical fashions, of course. So what were the results of their particular study? What did they learn from this? Well, I'm sorry for the chart here, but this is something taken from their page, of course. They're using scientific names, but that doesn't really matter to us as much as looking at the data here. And so when you're looking at they have the column notified as total captures, and that tells you how many animals were captured completely, and then they break down the number of captures per 100 trap nights. So that would be 50 nights with 2 traps, right? So that's 100 trap nights. Notice how, generally speaking, the Sherman column is always a bigger number than the wire mesh column. Now, it's not always the case if memory serves. There is one animal that's just Dipodomys spectabilis, and so I think that is Dipodomys. I think that's like a kangaroo rat, one of the versions of the kangaroo rat. So that was one animal that was caught by the wire mesh trap. But notice the problem: it was only one capture, so it's not statistically significant. So one trap, that could just be a kind of a fluke, so that one doesn't matter. But as a general rule, the Sherman column always caught more animals, often in a significant fashion, more than the wire mesh trap. So what does this tell us? At prima facie, in other words, at first glance, which is what prima facie means, it tells us that some of these small rodents are more likely to enter a box trap rather than a cage trap. In other words, so they like being enclosed. So the question is, does the animal you're trying to capture, is it claustrophobic or is it not claustrophobic? An animal that's not claustrophobic is going to feel comfortable in an enclosed space that it cannot see through, where an animal that is claustrophobic is going to be avoiding boxes in places that make them feel enclosed, right? So this is something that's rather important, and you can see the p-values. That p-value is a form of statistical analysis, the idea of how likely is the results not just simply a result of randomness. What is the likely that there is something real going on here? In other words, if you roll the dice enough times, you're going to get a certain run of numbers after a while, whether just randomly. But the point is that you always want to make sure that the random number of that you always want to make sure your study is large enough such that the likelihood of sixes always coming out is not really a result of randomness, but it actually is something in that we're learning something actually new. So what we find here is that for many of these animals, not all, but some of these animals, we're getting something significant or close to significance. But for our purposes in terms of as being wildlife control operators, we're interested in which one is going to capture me more animals, which one's going to help me solve the problem faster. And as a general rule for these small mammals, it's going to be the Sherman trap. Now, what did the researchers say about these results? Well, what they noted was that there was some research that showed that cage traps were actually more effective than box traps when going after small mammals. But that wasn't the case in this particular study. So why is that? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. They also noted that some research showed that longer traps were more effective than shorter traps. Well, what was the longer trap in this case? It was the cage trap. Let's go back to that. Notice the cage trap was an inch longer than the Sherman trap. Well, the researchers thought that 1 inch was not sufficiently different than the Sherman trap, so they didn't think it had any part to play in either to the advantage of cage traps or to the negative of cage traps. It just didn't matter. It wasn't enough. What they did think was possibly important here was that the brand of trap that they were using for the cage trap had some treadle sensitivity issues. And they were wondering whether or not the treadle, that's the trigger, in the cage trap wasn't sensitive enough, and that so that some animals were able to get in but not trigger the trap. Well, obviously that would be a pretty big issue to deal with, right? So this is something we certainly have to be careful of. So what can we learn from this? Well, when you're doing your own type of work and you're comparing one type of trap with another, you need to make sure that the treadles are sufficiently sensitive to one another. In other words, that one isn't harder to trigger than the other in a significant fashion. Fortunately, if you're trying to compare whether a box trap catches raccoons more than a cage trap, chances are the treadle is not going to be an issue in either of those because the raccoon is just too heavy. He will overcome any of those challenges, but it's still something to keep in the back of your mind. But if you're working with smaller animals, you really need to make sure that both types of traps have a sensitive enough trigger so that they're going to capture whatever comes into that cage or box. In this case, the Sherman trap had a more sensitive trigger than the cage trap, so therefore the cage trap may not have gotten as good of the numbers as animals that went into it, but they're not sure. Now you may be thinking, well, the odors in the traps may have been a confounding issue. Well, the researchers also made sure that they cleaned those traps before they used them and before they reused them. So that is likely not an issue. Certainly when it comes to box traps, urine and droppings and other body odors that are in that cage trap might be an issue, but they tried to account for that by using some cleaning materials to clean those traps to reduce the likelihood of odor being a confounding issue of comparing these two. So where do we go from this? Well, I mean, certainly there's nothing banging on the table here, but suggesting that perhaps if we take care of that treadle issue, it could be possible that the Sherman trap does capture small mammals better than the cage trap. But it's unclear at this point. You have to. This is something I want you to think about. Sometimes we read literature not so much to get quote unquote the answer, but it forces us to think about what we're doing in a different way. And I want you, if you're performing any trapping work, particularly with cage or box traps, ask yourself the question, are you keeping enough data to let you know whether the animals in your area are more comfortable going into a box trap or a cage trap? Have you found a pattern? Have you found that, does that depend on the species of the animal? Does it depend on animals that you think have become trap-wise? You can see where this can go, because the only way we're going to be able to compete against our competitors and win is we've got to do something different. If everyone's doing the same thing, you're all going to have the same level of income, or you're not going to be differentiating with your customer. And they say, well, I might as well just go with this person who might have a lower price point. Unless you're doing something different, you're not going to be able to increase profitability. So you've got to be thinking about this from time to time. And I encourage wildlife control operators to always be doing at least some little study in their work. And obviously you have to make a living, you got to do time, but you should be spending a little bit of time doing some sort of a study that goes on in finding out what is the best for your particular area. And if you're not, I think you need to start thinking about adding that. Well, I hope you found that conversation a little bit enlightening. Of course, here's my contact information. You can reach me, of course, at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com or Stephen at wildlifecontrolconsultant.com. Would love to hear from you. Do visit us on Facebook. You can join the Pest Keek podcast on Facebook. Join the revolution, as Franklin likes to call it. You can also, I'd love to hear from you if you have ideas for new shows, topics you'd like to have covered. Perhaps you'd like to be interviewed on the show. We'd love to have you. I think I'm always intrigued by the number of people who are afraid to be interviewed for some reason. But I think if you look back over my interviews with other people, it is not a problem. I've not had anyone who's been interviewed by me who said that it was a horrific experience. So I think it's something we need to get quality information out there to the public. And so we want to be sure that we're doing this for the professional. Why? Because that's the only way we're going to improve our industry, is making sure our knowledge is improved and that we apply that knowledge. And then I also hope those of you that listen who are not wildlife control professionals, I hope this helps you raise the standard for what you expect from your professional. But also, if you're looking to do your own work, you'll get some tidbits on how to make sure that you at least are working like a professional to resolve problems in your own particular area. Well, thanks for listening again. This is Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Keek podcast. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, we call it Living the Wildlife because we don't want you to be the wildlife. Take care, everyone. Until next time, bye-bye.